The temperature had dropped to 40 below zero, and Otto Reinhardt could hear the wind screaming across the Montana mountains like a living thing trying to kill him. Inside his dugout shelter, buried 4 feet into the hillside with 3 feet of snow piled on top, he sat by a fire no bigger than his hand and stayed warm enough to survive the night that killed 11 men in surface cabins within 20 miles. Before we continue, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from, and if you've ever experienced a winter storm that made you question your shelter. Hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's story might just save your life someday. The year was 1891. The Montana goldfields were entering their second decade of serious exploitation, and men were still getting rich if they were willing to risk everything. Otto Reinhardt had been willing. He had left Germany in 1884 at age 23, worked in Chicago factories for 2 years, saved every penny, and headed west with enough money to buy basic mining equipment and 6 months of supplies. By 1891, he had been working a claim near the headwaters of the Boulder River for 3 years. He was competent, careful, and reasonably successful. His claim produced enough gold to keep him supplied and put a little money aside each season. But he was also aware that Montana winters killed men with brutal regularity. Most prospectors accepted winter danger as an unavoidable cost of the profession. They built simple cabins in late summer, stockpiled firewood, laid in supplies, and hoped for mild weather. When winter arrived hard, people died. It was understood. Otto had survived 3 Montana winters before 1891, and each one had taught him something about the limits of conventional shelter. Standard prospector cabins were built quickly because mining season was short. A typical cabin took 4 to 6 days to construct with 2 men working. Logs were cut to rough length, notched at corners, stacked with moss or mud pressed between gaps, topped with a roof of poles and bark, and fitted with a simple door. The structures kept out rain and blocked wind. That was usually enough. But Otto had noticed troubling patterns. During his first winter, a prospector named William Cross froze to death when his cabin door blew open during a storm, and he could not force it closed against the wind. During his second winter, a cabin 3 miles from Otto's collapsed under heavy snow, killing both occupants. During his third winter, Otto himself had nearly died when his chimney became blocked with ice, filling his cabin with smoke and forcing him outside into 20 below temperatures to clear it. He survived only because the storm broke the next morning. These experiences made Otto question assumptions most men accepted without thinking. Why did prospectors build the same type of cabin that failed so regularly? Why was there no improvement? No evolution in design? The answer, he realized, was that most prospectors were transient. They worked a claim for 1 or 2 seasons, then moved on. If they survived winter, they considered their cabin adequate. If they died, they obviously could not share what they had learned. There was no institutional memory, no accumulated wisdom. Each man built what he had seen others build and hoped for the best. Otto was different. He planned to work his claim for at least 5 more years. He intended to survive those winters. And after what happened in April of 1891, survival became an obsession that would change how prospectors sheltered themselves across the entire northern Rocky Mountain region. Otto had partnered that spring with Charles Brennan, an Irish immigrant who had come to Montana 2 years earlier. Charles was 41 years old, experienced in mining, and good company during the isolated months of mountain work. They had met the previous fall and agreed to work, adjacent claims cooperatively, sharing equipment and labor when it made sense. Charles had his own cabin about half a mile from Otto's, positioned near a good water source. It was typical construction. Logs notched and stacked, mud chinked between gaps, a single room with a stone fireplace, a plank door hung on leather hinges. Charles had built it himself in 5 days during late summer of 1890. It had served him adequately through 1 winter. On April 9, 1891, a late-season storm moved through the area. These spring storms were common in Montana, often dumping heavy wet snow that melted within days. This particular storm brought high winds and temperatures that dropped rapidly after sunset. Otto stayed in his cabin, keeping his fire going and waiting for the weather to pass. The storm lasted 2 days. When it cleared on April 11th, Otto went to check on Charles. He found his partner dead. Charles had frozen during the night of April 10th. Otto pieced together what had happened from evidence inside the cabin. The stone fireplace chimney had developed a crack during the winter, probably from repeated freeze-thaw cycles. During the storm, wind had blown down the chimney, and the crack had widened. Smoke had filled the cabin. Charles had faced a choice: stay inside and suffocate, or let the fire die and try to survive the night without heat. He had chosen the latter. He had wrapped himself in every blanket he owned and climbed into his bunk. The temperature inside the cabin had dropped below zero. Charles had frozen to death in his sleep. Otto buried him on a hillside overlooking the creek where Charles had worked his claim. He marked the grave with stones and spent that night in his own cabin, unable to sleep. The manner of Charles's death disturbed him profoundly. Charles had not died from an accident or a grisly attack or any dramatic cause. He had died because his shelter had failed in a completely predictable way. The chimney had cracked. The fire had become unusable. The cabin had offered no protection without fire. It was an engineering failure, pure and simple. Otto realized that his own cabin was barely better. His chimney could crack, his fire could fail. If that happened during a serious storm, he would die exactly as Charles had died. The conventional cabin design had a fundamental flaw. It provided shelter only as long as you could maintain a large fire. If the fire failed for any reason, the cabin became a death trap. The wood walls offered minimal insulation. Heat escaped rapidly through gaps in the chinking and roof. Without continuous fire, interior temperature equalized with exterior temperature within hours. Otto needed a better solution. Otto finished the spring mining season working Charles's claim in addition to his own. It seemed proper. He sold the combined gold output in Helena in late June and settled Charles's debts from the proceeds. The remainder he sent to Charles's sister in Boston, along with a letter explaining what had happened. Then he returned to the mountains, but not to mine. He had decided to spend the summer solving the shelter problem. He had 3 months before he needed to stockpile supplies for winter. He intended to use that time to build something that would not kill him. He started by talking to every prospector and trapper he encountered. Most built standard cabins and accepted the risks. But in early July, Otto met a man who offered a different perspective. Silas Boone was 62 years old, a former fur trapper who now prospected casually, more for something to do than for profit. Silas had spent 15 years trapping in the Dakota Territories during the 1850s and 60s. He had survived winters that killed younger, stronger men. When Otto asked how, Silas described dugout shelters. The prairie tribes had used them for generations. Instead of building upward with wood, they dug downward into earth. A dugout was exactly what the name suggested. You excavated a rectangular pit 4 to 5 feet deep, framed the opening with logs or stone, roofed it over with poles and sod, and lived underground. Silas had built 3 such shelters during his trapping years. He claimed they were superior to surface cabins in every way that mattered for survival. Otto asked why more people did not build them. Silas shrugged. Cultural bias, mostly. White men considered living underground uncivilized. They associated dugouts with poverty and primitiveness. A man who built a proper cabin above ground demonstrated success and respectability. A man who lived in a hole demonstrated failure. But Silas noted that proper cabins killed people regularly, while dugouts did not. Otto asked about the engineering principles. Silas explained thermal mass. The earth 4 feet below the surface maintained a constant temperature year-round, approximately 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. This occurred regardless of surface conditions. In summer, the earth was cooler than air temperature. In winter, it was warmer. A dugout surrounded by earth stayed close to that constant temperature naturally. You did not need a large fire to heat it. A small fire merely raised the temperature from the Earth's baseline of 50 degrees to a comfortable 65 or 70 degrees. If the fire went out, the structure did not freeze. It returned to 50 degrees, which was cold but survivable with blankets. Silas also explained that earth was an excellent insulator when dry. Several feet of soil provided far better insulation than 8 inches of wood. Wind could not penetrate earth. Snow accumulation on the roof actually improved insulation rather than threatening structural collapse if the roof was built strong enough. Otto listened carefully. The physics made sense. Earth did not burn. It did not crack like chimneys. It required no maintenance. It simply existed at constant temperature. Otto returned to his claim with a shovel and a plan. He had purchased the shovel in Helena, a flat blade design with an iron head and a 5-foot ash handle. It cost $3, a significant expense, but it was the essential tool for what he intended to build. He also purchased a hand axe for shaping logs and 20 pounds of square-cut nails for critical connections. Everything else he would find on site. He selected a location on a south-facing slope about 50 yards from the creek. The spot offered good drainage, clear sight lines, and would receive maximum sunlight during winter months. Most importantly, the slope allowed him to dig horizontally into the hillside rather than straight down. This created a natural entrance approach and simplified construction. He marked out dimensions of 8 feet wide by 12 feet deep and began digging. The work was brutal. Mountain soil was dense, packed with rocks and roots. Otto averaged about 3 cubic feet of earth removed per hour of hard labor. He worked 6 hours per day, taking frequent breaks to rest his back and hands. At that pace, excavating the full chamber required 6 weeks of continuous effort. Other prospectors who passed by thought he was insane. Arthur Hayes, who worked a claim 2 miles downstream, stopped to watch one afternoon in late July. Hayes was a loud man, 45 years old, who had been prospecting in Montana for 8 years. He asked Otto what he was building. When Otto explained, Hayes laughed. "You are digging your own grave," he said. "No white man lives in a hole like a prairie dog. Build a proper cabin like civilized people." Otto did not argue. He simply kept digging. By mid-August, the main chamber was complete. Otto had created a rectangular room 8 feet wide, 12 feet long, and 5 feet deep at the back wall. The floor was level, the walls were vertical, and the ceiling line where the roof would sit was clearly defined. He had removed approximately 240 cubic feet of earth, all moved, with his shovel in increments of half a shovelful at a time. His hands had blistered, healed, and developed thick calluses. His back ached constantly, but he had the foundation for what he needed. Next came the entrance framework. He cut 2 logs 8 inches in diameter and 5 feet long for the vertical posts. He dug post holes 2 feet deep on either side of the entrance opening and set the posts, tamping earth firmly around their bases. For the lintel, he selected a heavy log 10 inches in diameter and cut it to 5-foot length. He positioned it across the top of the vertical posts, creating a door frame that would support the roof weight above the entrance. The framework took 3 days to complete. When finished, he had a stable opening 3 feet wide and 4 feet high, leading into his excavated chamber. Half the work remained. Otto spent the next 2 weeks cutting and hauling logs. He needed approximately 50 logs, each 8 to 10 inches in diameter and 8 to 12 feet in length, depending on their purpose. He selected pine trees that were straight, relatively uniform in diameter, and free of significant taper or irregular growth. He felled them with his hand axe, limbed them, and dragged them to his construction site using a rope harness. The work was slow. Each log required an hour to fell, limb, and transport. He worked methodically, building his supply until he had more logs than he estimated needing. The wall construction began in late August. Otto's technique was simple but effective. He stacked the logs horizontally against the excavated earth walls, starting at floor level. The first log on each side rested directly on the packed earth floor. The second log was laid on top of the first. The third on top of the second. He worked his way upward, course by course, until the stacked logs extended from floor level to approximately 4 feet above ground. The critical factor was log selection. Otto spent considerable time choosing which log to place next. He wanted logs of similar diameter stacked together to minimize gaps. When he found two logs that fit tightly, he used them in sequence. When gaps appeared, he selected the next log specifically to fill the space. This careful selection process meant the walls went up slowly. Where a careless builder could stack logs in a few hours, Otto spent 3 days completing his walls. But the result was worth the time investment. The gaps between his logs were minimal, often less than a quarter inch. Some logs touched along their entire length with no gap at all. At the corners, Otto used a technique Silas Boone had mentioned. Instead of notching the logs to interlock, he simply extended them past the corner intersection by 12 to 18 inches. This created a crisscross pattern of log ends sticking out at each corner. It looked crude, but it was structurally sound. The weight of upper logs pressed down on lower logs, and the extensions prevented any single log from rolling or shifting. The earth behind the logs provided additional stability. To disassemble Otto's walls, you would need to lift the entire structure vertically. Gravity and earth pressure made that impossible. The interior surface of the walls was the same round log surface as the exterior. Otto did no shaping or finishing. The logs were simply stacked in their natural round form. This left a slightly irregular interior surface, but it also meant the full thickness of each log contributed to insulation and structural strength. The walls were 8 to 10 inches thick of solid wood, backed by 4 feet of earth on the sides and back. The thermal mass was enormous. By early September, the walls were complete. Otto had a chamber dug into the hillside, framed with an entrance, and walled with tightly stacked logs. Now came the most critical component. The roof would determine whether Otto's design succeeded or failed. A conventional cabin roof was built to be lightweight, shedding rain and supporting perhaps 500 pounds of snow before needing reinforcement. Otto's roof needed to support thousands of pounds permanently. He would be piling soil and sod on top, and Montana winters would add feet of snow. The structure had to bear that load indefinitely without sagging or collapsing. Otto started with log beams. He selected his straightest, thickest logs, each approximately 10 inches in diameter and 8 feet long. These would span the width of his chamber from the front wall to the back earth wall. He positioned the first beam across the span, resting one end on the horizontal lintel above the entrance and the other end on the excavated earth shelf at the back. He tested it by hanging his full body weight from the center. It barely flexed. He added the second beam parallel to the first, spacing it 10 inches away. Then the third, the fourth, continuing until he had laid 9 beams side by side across the entire 12-foot length of the chamber. The beams created a solid log ceiling with minimal gaps between them. Otto had deliberately chosen logs of similar diameter so they would sit flush against each other. Where small gaps appeared, he wedged short sections of split wood to fill them. The result was a ceiling that was structurally robust and relatively airtight. Standing inside the chamber looking up, Otto saw a ceiling of round logs that would support enormous weight. Over the log beams, Otto laid smaller branches and poles perpendicular to the main beams. These filled the slight gaps that remained and created a more uniform surface for the layers above. He spent half a day gathering and placing these cross members, ensuring complete coverage. Next came moss. He collected bags of living moss from the surrounding forest and spread it in a thick layer over the entire roof surface. The moss served multiple purposes. It filled tiny gaps, provided additional insulation, and would help retain the soil layer above it. Over the moss, Otto spread soil. He used the same earth he had excavated from the chamber, now dried and loose. He shoveled it onto the roof until he had built up a layer 4 to 6 inches thick across the entire surface. He shaped the soil to create a slight pitch for water drainage, higher in the center and sloping gently toward the edges. Over the soil, he laid evergreen boughs, cutting fresh branches from nearby pine trees and spreading them generously. The boughs would help retain the soil and provide additional insulation. The final layer would come naturally. When winter arrived and snow fell, it would accumulate on the roof. That snow would act as insulation, trapping air and preventing heat loss. A foot of snow provided approximately 12 units of insulation value, equivalent to several inches of modern fiberglass. Otto's roof was designed to welcome snow, not resist it. Otto completed his dugout shelter in mid-September 1891. He spent 2 weeks finishing interior details. He built a sleeping platform from split logs, raised 18 inches off the floor, and positioned along the back wall where earth temperature was most stable. He constructed a small fireplace in the corner, lining it with flat stones he gathered from the creek. The chimney was simple, just stacked stones forming a narrow flue that extended 2 feet above the roof surface. He installed a heavy plank door at the entrance, hung on iron hinges he had brought from Helena. The door was thick, reinforced with cross braces, and fitted tightly into the frame. He moved his supplies into the dugout in late September: flour, salt, coffee, dried beans, bacon, ammunition, and all the items he would need to survive until spring. He stored them on shelves he had built into the earth walls, carved directly into the packed soil and reinforced with boards. He brought in his mining equipment, his tools, and his personal belongings. By the 1st of October, he was ready for winter. Other prospectors had watched his progress with amusement. Arthur Hayes visited twice more during construction, each time predicting failure. "You will suffocate in that hole," Hayes said, "or the roof will cave in and bury you. Or you will go mad, living like an animal underground." Otto thanked him for his concern and continued working. Most prospectors were finishing their own preparations. They had built or repaired their conventional cabins, cut massive piles of firewood, and were settling in for the traditional pattern of Montana winter survival. Burn wood constantly, stay inside during storms, hope for mild weather. The winter of 1891 to 1892 began early. On November 3rd, a storm system moved south from Canada, bringing the first serious cold of the season. Temperatures dropped from the 40s into the 20s over 2 days. Snow fell lightly. Most prospectors started burning their fireplaces regularly. Otto lit a small fire in his stone fireplace and was surprised by how little wood he needed. The dugout maintained a baseline temperature around 50 degrees without any fire at all. A fire the size of his hand raised the interior temperature to 65 degrees. He was comfortable in a single layer of clothing. On November 18th, the blizzard arrived. Weather in the mountains could change rapidly, but this storm was unprecedented. The temperature dropped from 30 degrees to 0 in 6 hours. Wind increased from calm to sustained speeds above 50 miles per hour. Snow began falling in the afternoon and did not stop for 4 days. By the second day, visibility was measured in feet. Drifts built to heights of 6, 8, 10 feet in sheltered areas. The wind screamed across the mountains with a sound like continuous thunder. And the temperature continued dropping, 30 below zero, 40 below, 50 below with wind chill. Otto spent the first day of the blizzard listening to wind he could barely hear. The dugout was so well insulated by earth that external sounds were muffled to distant murmurs. He could hear the storm, but it sounded far away, like something happening to someone else. Inside his shelter, the temperature held steady. He maintained a fire roughly the size of a dinner plate, feeding it small pieces of wood every hour. The stone fireplace drew well. Smoke rose through the chimney without filling the interior. The earth walls radiated gentle warmth from the heat they absorbed during the day. He used approximately 1/10 the firewood he would have burned in a surface cabin. A conventional cabin required a roaring fire to maintain livable temperature because heat escaped constantly through gaps in the chinking, through the thin wooden walls, through the roof. Otto's dugout lost heat so slowly that his small fire easily compensated. He could let the fire die completely, and the interior temperature would drop only to 50 degrees over several hours. He tested this on the second night, letting the fire go out while he slept. When he woke 6 hours later, the dugout was cool, but not cold. He relit the fire, and within 30 minutes, the space was comfortable again. Outside, men were dying. Otto did not know this during the storm, but he would learn the details afterward. Vincent Colby, who worked a claim 4 miles north, had built a standard cabin the previous summer. When the blizzard hit, Colby burned every piece of furniture he owned trying to stay warm. His firewood supply, which he had thought adequate, was exhausted by the 3rd day. He burned his table, his chairs, his sleeping platform, the boards from his shelves. When that was gone, he wrapped himself in blankets and tried to survive. The cabin interior dropped to 20 below zero. Colby froze to death on the 4th night of the storm. Arthur Hayes, who had mocked Otto's dugout so confidently, nearly died as well. His cabin roof, designed to shed rain and support moderate snow, began failing under the accumulated weight on the 3rd day. Hayes heard the support poles cracking. He spent 12 hours holding up the center beam with his back and shoulders, preventing total collapse. When the beam finally gave way, he managed to crawl out through a window before the roof came down completely. He stumbled through waist-deep snow to another prospector's cabin half a mile away. Both men survived by burning everything flammable and huddling together for warmth. Otto knew none of this while it was happening. He sat in his dugout, warm and safe, reading a book by firelight. He ate meals cooked over his small fire. He slept comfortably on his platform. On the 5th day, the wind began to diminish. On the 6th day, the snow stopped. On the 7th day, the sun appeared. Otto used his shovel to dig out on the morning of November 25th. Snow had accumulated 3 feet deep on his roof, and drifts near the entrance had piled to 5 feet. He dug a trench from his door to open ground, working methodically. The snow was dry and light, easy to move. Within 2 hours he had cleared a path and stood on the surface surveying the transformed landscape. The world was white and silent. Evergreen trees sagged under snow loads. The creek was frozen solid. The temperature was still 20 below zero, but the wind had stopped. He walked toward Arthur Hayes's claim, breaking trail through knee-deep snow. It took him 3 hours to cover 2 miles. When he reached Hayes's location, he found the cabin destroyed. The roof had collapsed completely, crushing the interior. He called out, no response. He began to worry that Hayes had died inside, but then saw tracks leading away through the snow. Someone had escaped and headed east. Otto followed the tracks to another cabin where he found Hayes and Patrick Murphy huddled near a failing fire. Both men were alive, but exhausted. They had been burning furniture for 2 days and had perhaps 6 hours of fuel remaining. Otto told them his dugout had weathered the storm without difficulty. Hayes stared at him with hollow eyes. "Your hole in the ground," he said quietly. Otto nodded. Hayes asked if Otto had room for 2 more. Otto said no. The space was built for 1 person, but he could help them reach Helena if they wanted to leave the mountains. Hayes shook his head. He would rebuild, he said, but this time he would build different. Otto continued checking on other prospectors over the next week. He found Vincent Colby's body on November 27th. Colby had frozen in his cabin, still wrapped in blankets. Otto buried him when the ground thawed the following spring. He found 2 other prospectors dead from similar causes, men he had known casually but not well. He found several others who had survived but lost their cabins to roof collapse or had exhausted their firewood and were preparing to evacuate to lower elevations. On December 2nd, Otto encountered Jacob Turner, a prospector who worked a claim near the upper reaches of the Boulder River. Turner had survived the blizzard in a conventional cabin but had come dangerously close to freezing. His firewood supply had run critically low, and his cabin had provided almost no insulation once the fire diminished. Turner had heard about Otto's dugout from other prospectors. He asked to see it. Otto agreed. Turner spent 2 hours examining every aspect of the construction. He studied the entrance framework, the horizontal log walls, the roof beam system, the interior layout. He asked detailed questions about excavation, about thermal performance, about firewood consumption. When he finished, he told Otto he would build an identical structure before next winter. He asked permission. Otto told him the design belonged to anyone who wanted to use it. Knowledge that saved lives should be shared freely. Jacob Turner built his dugout in the summer of 1892. He followed Otto's design closely, excavating into a hillside, stacking horizontal logs with tight spacing, and creating a robust roof capable of supporting heavy snow loads. Arthur Hayes, humbled by his near-death experience, built one as well. By the fall of 1892, 7 dugout shelters existed in the Boulder River drainage, all based on the technique Otto had developed. The winter of 1892 to 1893 was severe, though not as catastrophic as the previous year. Every man who had built a dugout survived comfortably. Several men in conventional cabins died. Word spread through the prospecting community. Dugouts became recognized as superior winter shelter for mountain conditions. The technique spread to other mining districts. By 1893, prospectors in the Highland Mountains were building dugouts. By 1894, the design had reached the Tobacco Root Range and the Pioneers. The specific details varied based on local conditions and individual skill, but the core principles remained consistent. Dig into the earth, use horizontal, log construction, build a strong roof, let snow accumulate as insulation. The cultural resistance faded rapidly. Men who had initially considered dugouts primitive came to understand they were actually sophisticated. The engineering was sound, the physics were undeniable. A shelter that used the Earth's constant temperature as its baseline and required minimal firewood to maintain comfort was objectively superior to a shelter that depended entirely on continuous fire. Otto's innovation was not about better materials or advanced tools. It was about understanding how to work with natural principles instead of against them. Otto himself left Montana in 1895. He had worked his claim for 8 years and accumulated enough money to start a different life. He sold his mining equipment, filed the paperwork to abandon his claim, and traveled to Oregon. He settled near Salem, purchased a small farm, and in 1896 married Margaret Sutter, a widow with 2 children. He raised her children as his own, farmed successfully, and lived quietly. He never returned to Montana. When people asked about his past, he mentioned he had been a prospector but rarely discussed details. To his family and neighbors, he was simply a competent farmer who had come west like thousands of others. But in the Montana mountains, his legacy remained. Dugout shelters built in the 1890s continued to be used into the 1920s and beyond. Prospectors, trappers, hunters, and eventually forest rangers occupied them. Some lasted for decades with minimal maintenance because earth and properly laid logs deteriorated slowly. The shelters saved lives in storms that destroyed surface cabins. The exact number of lives saved is unknowable, but historical records reference multiple instances of survival specifically attributed to earth-sheltered construction during severe weather. The story of Otto Reinhardt demonstrates that frontier innovation often came from necessity rather than theory. One man who refused to accept that his shelter should kill him created something better using only a shovel and basic carpentry.